Well, thank you. I first want to say what a pleasure it is to be back. It has been a long time since I've been here, it's true. But in addition to working at Microsoft, I'm on the Netflix board of directors, and one of my responsibilities, therefore, is to watch Netflix shows, which means I've been seeing images of Canberra every evening in season 2 of Secret City. And I want you to know that my family is among the millions of people in the world who believe that this is the most interesting and exciting capital anywhere that one can possibly find. Now, sadly, I have been informed by the authors here today that it is a work of fiction. Nonetheless, I think it'll be good for tourism, so your secret is safe with me. It's been quite something, including the wonderful images that it has brought to life of this beautiful city. What I wanted to talk about today was a little more serious than that. It's about these issues of privacy, of security, really of safety in the world, and what technology means for it. We live in this time when technology obviously has become ubiquitous. It's been a long time, as you heard, since that moment when I was unusual by asking for a computer. And we live in a world today where technology powers everything we do. But we sadly also live in a world where technology is not just a tool. People are turning it into weapons as well. And certainly in this part of the world, in this month of March in 2019, in a week that for me started with 2 days in Wellington, I think it's important simply to acknowledge from the start that this is a learning moment for the world. It's a learning moment in New Zealand, certainly watching the debate here. It's a learning moment in Australia, but I think more importantly, it's a learning moment for everybody. And certainly as I found myself engaged in conversations in New Zealand and here as well, I think one has to start by acknowledging the obvious. No matter what people did to try to use technology more effectively to prevent the kinds of horrific videos that got distributed around the world from the terrorist tragedy in Christchurch, we didn't do enough. Technology didn't do what it needed to do. And so we really come together at a moment where I think one has to begin by acknowledging that the tech sector needs to do more. And I think one needs to acknowledge that government itself has an ever-growing role to play, moving at an ever faster pace to address these issues. So I would say, while I came a month ago thinking I would talk about privacy and security and ethics for AI, I think we almost have to start for a moment by acknowledging that safety is equally important and belongs in that same list. As we've talked in New Zealand and talking here this week and talking later today in Washington, D.C., there's at least 3 areas where we all need to work together. One is to prevent the kinds of incidents that took place. The second is to respond to crises. We can certainly not assume that there will never be another tragedy or crisis in the world. And we need to take from the cybersecurity space part of what we've learned and apply it to the safety space as well. And I think that there is a role to be considered, not just for technology and government, but for everyone, just in terms of what it will take to create a healthier online environment. It is striking to see on some sad days the degree to which digital discourse has become so toxic. And while there's a huge leap from hateful speech to an armed attack, we don't create a safer world when people seem to lose sight that the standards of civilization in the real world also actually need to apply online. So we have a lot of work to do. And in many ways, I think the learning that can come out of the important work that needs to be done can inform and infuse the other topics that I wanted to talk about today. These issues of privacy, security, and ethics for artificial intelligence. I will have the opportunity to dive deeper into some of these later in the lunch. But let me begin by offering some views on where these issues have come from and where they're going. Let's start with privacy. I think, in fact, we are living through a privacy earthquake around the world. For many years, when I would talk to people in the tech sector, I would talk about privacy by beginning with a story about 3 Mile Island, the island in Pennsylvania where in 1979 a nuclear power plant experienced a meltdown. In the United States, the nuclear power industry wasn't prepared for it. They thought it would never happen. And when it did occur, because of that lack of thoughtfulness, nuclear power in the United States stopped in its tracks. It would take 34 years before there would be the construction of another nuclear power plant in the United States of America. And I always felt that there would come a day when there would be a 3 Mile Island for privacy. Last year, about this time of year, it came. It was called Cambridge Analytica. And you always look at these things and you wonder, well, why was that the one thing that was the tipping point or the inflection point? And there are many reasons, but I think there were so many factors at play there. So many people were impacted. Their information was used in ways that they had never imagined, and for many people it impacted politics in a way that they couldn't possibly be comfortable supporting. It absolutely changed the conversation in the United States, the country which, as I'm sure you all appreciate, was the slowest, really the latest of the world's great democracies to embrace the need for national privacy legislation. It was actually something that we called for as a company in 2005, and no one got excited. But now it's the talk of Washington, D.C., and it continues to ripple around the world. It's rippling around the world in part because of the continuing leadership we're seeing out of Europe, which really has been the leader in protecting privacy almost since the conclusion of World War II. And the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, really, I think, created a new Magna Carta for data that every data privacy commissioner around the world is having to think about. One of the things that we did last May when the GDPR took effect in Europe was step back and look at what had been hundreds of millions of dollars of investment involving hundreds and ultimately thousands of employees to create a new technical privacy architecture for Microsoft. And we decided to do something that, as of yet, no other tech company has done. We said we would extend the rights that were available to Europeans under GDPR and make them available to all of our customers everywhere in the world. And the most interesting thing we've learned is that people care. They care everywhere. On a per capita basis, Americans have used these rights far more than Europeans, and that in and of itself has been an interesting insight. And the same is true as we look at the public in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. And of course, the privacy right involves not just what companies are doing with data, it's what governments are doing with data as well. And big issue, obviously, here in New Zealand. I'm sorry, that was yesterday. Australia. It's an issue that has thrown us into the forefront of this debate actually since 2013, when the Snowden disclosures took place. It's why we took 4 lawsuits forward against the Obama administration, an administration that we had a very cordial relationship with, to try to establish clearer rules of the road. We believe strongly that law enforcement and the intelligence community needs access to data to keep the public safe. But we also believe it needs to be governed by the rule of law and with a respect for privacy. And so what we've been talking with governments around the world is a continued focus on the principles that we believe in and that will stand up to defend. About the importance of independent determinations, whether it's a different ministry or judicial review, depending on the country. Universal rights to notice under most circumstances at some point in time. The need to have a complete legal process. The need to have modern rules to protect enterprises, something that I think deserves far more conversation and attention. The need for a new generation of international agreements so governments, especially like-minded democratic governments, can work together. And the importance of transparency. All issues that are alive and important here in Australia as they are in many other countries. Clearly, as we look to the future, the evolution of privacy from both a commercial standpoint and what companies can do, and from the perspective of citizens and the role of government, has a long life ahead of it. I think we're going to see ongoing evolution of this easily over the next decade. As privacy has been moving forward, obviously cybersecurity has as well. And from our perspective, it's an important moment to step back. Because in 2017, the world had two wake-up calls. On the 12th of May, the world experienced the WannaCry attack, launched by North Korea. It impacted more than 300,000 computers in more than 150 countries around the world. And just 6 weeks later, the world witnessed NotPetya, an attack against Ukraine launched by Russia that rippled well beyond those borders and impacted global companies around the world. More than 10% of all of the computers in Ukraine were disabled. People could not get money out of automated teller machines. People could not pay for groceries because their credit cards would not work. The world woke up. But I would argue that in some ways, the world hit the snooze button on the alarm clock. And what we're continuing to see around the world is an increasing proliferation of more sophisticated nation-state attacks by a subset of governments that are affecting us all. It's a critical issue that I believe demands even more of the world's attention. Certainly in the tech sector, it is required that we bring an integrated approach to cybersecurity. I think we always have to start by recognizing and acknowledging that we are the first line of defense and have the first responsibility to keep people safe. These are our platforms, these are our technologies. But it has become a shared responsibility with customers, and ultimately it is an important governmental responsibility as well. It is a responsibility that for us in the tech sector requires an integrated approach, continued investment in new technology to strengthen defenses, but also operations and partnerships and policy as well. For us, cybersecurity operations has become a huge discipline. We have what I think is quite possibly one of the world's most sophisticated threat intelligence centers, because there are over 6 trillion signals a day that come from around the world into our data centers that we're able to analyze to discern and identify new cybersecurity threats and attacks. But we don't stop simply when we identify what's going on. When we see a customer being attacked, we go to that customer. But equally important, increasingly, we take action to do what we can, typically in partnership with governments, to disrupt these kinds of attacks. We started in the last decade really focusing on the growth of botnets that we saw being exploited by organized criminal enterprises around the world, a phenomenon that continues, that increasingly are launched by computers in countries that are beyond the reach of the rule of law. But we've devised techniques where we can go to courts in different countries and work with law enforcement agencies to gain legal control over the domains that are being used and put these botnets out of business. We can use that to identify the computers that have been infected and then work with customers to clean them up. And what we started doing in the organized criminal space, we have increasingly been doing in the nation-state space as well. Starting in 2016, when we saw attacks against political candidates and parties involved in the US presidential election, we went to court and developed a new basis where we could see these domains transferred. And increasingly, we felt compelled not just to take action, but to be explicit publicly about what we're seeing. What we saw in the United States, what we've seen in Europe, what we see around the world, especially as we see these attacks not just against politicians and political parties, but increasingly against think tanks and universities and others. We believe that the only way to get this problem under control is, frankly, to have the courage to start talking about it so that across the democracies of the world, people can do more together. It's also what led us last year to launch a new program, the Defending Democracy program. It's really a program that focuses on 3 problems. The first is the threats to candidates and parties. We created a new program called Account Guard. We launched it in Australia last week. It's where we provide free of charge advanced threat intelligence services and training and other prevention to protect people who are running for office. But we also recognize that that's not the sole threat to democracy that technology is being used to create. There are threats to voting that will demand new technology solutions and new partnerships between companies like ours and governments around the world. And there are threats to the public more generally in the social media space when we see the trends around disinformation. So this too will remain a very vibrant space where new initiatives and innovation is going to be needed. We also see a role for the tech sector increasingly to get its act together, to work together, to take new steps. That's why 12 months ago we launched in San Francisco a global tech accord. The idea was to bring companies from across the industry together to commit to 4 principles: that we would protect all of our customers everywhere in the world, that we would not aid any government in attacking an innocent civilian or enterprise anywhere in the world, that we would work together to increase resilience in the ecosystem, and we would help each other when there's an attack. We were really enthused last March when we launched this with 34 companies. And what is exciting to me today, a year later, is not only to see those principles being turned into projects that mean real action to strengthen industry standards and improve cybersecurity, but that group of 34 has now become a group of 90 companies. And it is continuing to grow on a multinational basis. And we felt that what was important for the tech sector actually needed to be pursued more broadly. I think the future of so many of these issues is both multilateral diplomacy by governments, but also multi-stakeholder diplomacy that brings together governments and the tech sector and civil society. And so for us, a big and important day last year was the 12th of November in Paris, when President Macron unveiled the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, a declaration that built on existing international norms in the field of cybersecurity, that added a new focus on the protection of elections and democracies, that called on people to work together and called on the tech sector to accept new responsibility, to take steps to better keep people safe. It is a call that I believe especially speaks to the world's democracies. And we were able to work closely with the French government. Today it has more than 500 signatories, including more than 60 governments. With the notable exception of the United States and India, it has brought together the world's democracies. And I want to acknowledge and thank this government, because the Australian government's leadership in working with the French government and other nations, in part to bring together 4 of the 5 Eyes, was of fundamental importance in trying to take this kind of movement forward. And the Australian government's support, I believe, will just be critical as we look to strengthening our multilateral defenses. And that really brings us to the last issue I wanted to touch upon: artificial intelligence and ethics. In a fascinating way, this issue was just breaking into the public consciousness about 14 or 15 months ago, but it has exploded. It has exploded because people have appreciated how quickly AI is moving forward and how much it is enabling computers to do. But as we noted in a book that we published a year ago, ultimately the question is not only what computers can do. The bigger question for all of us, especially in every national capital, is what should computers do? That is what the public will need to grapple with, and that is what elected governments especially will need to decide. From our perspective, this needs to be grounded in a set of ethical principles. And what you see in a very positive way is a number of different companies, both in the tech space and in the broader accounting and advisory services space, coming forward to outline their view of ethics. And the good news is there's a lot of similarity. What we shared a year ago was 6 ethical principles. And we said this isn't the perfect way, it's by no means the only way, but it certainly seems to us that the ethics of AI require that the people who create AI and the people who deploy it, meaning basically eventually almost every institution on the planet, will need to think about questions like fairness to avoid bias, about reliability and safety. Really internalize the issues around privacy and security and understand deeply what AI means for inclusiveness. Because we live in a world where 1 of every 7 individuals on the planet has a disability. It may be permanent, it may be temporary, it may be a physical disability, it may be a mental disability, but if we don't do a good job of thinking about what this technology means for this fundamentally important and large group of people, we risk creating technology that makes their lives more difficult, when instead, this is a technology that can improve their daily lives and enable them to achieve even more in the world. But the other thing we noted was that all 4 of these principles, in our view, rested on 2 others. One is transparency. We have to ensure that this technology is transparent and explainable and understandable so the public can know what it is, how it works, and whether we are doing a good job. And finally, we have to focus on what I genuinely believe is perhaps one of the most fundamental questions and issues for our time that speaks almost uniquely to the generation of people that are alive today: accountability. We are the first generation of people that is empowering computers to make decisions that previously could only be made by human beings. Will we ensure that machines remain accountable to people? Will we ensure that the people who create these machines remain accountable to everyone else? I don't think it's exaggeration to say that the future and future generations are depending on us to get this right, because if we do not, they are going to have a much harder time cleaning up the mess that will be left in our wake. What we've also seen over the last year is that these issues around ethics that started as this general topic are very quickly evolving into a set of very specific issues. And I think we're going to continue to see that over the next 5 or 10 years. And it's here where the rubber will really meet the road. We were called upon, really by our own employees in part last year, to ask ourselves, what did we think needed to be put in place for facial recognition? We said these are really important technologies. They'll do great things for many people around the world, but they are very powerful. And if they're not managed well, they could lead to new issues and concerns around bias and discrimination. They can lead to a new era of really commercial surveillance as people walk into stores and they're monitored in terms of what they're picking up and buying or putting back on the shelf. And that perhaps most fundamentally, they raise questions for the future of democracy. Because democracy depends in no small measure on the ability of people peacefully to assemble, to express their views. And one needs to think hard about what it would mean if we live in societies where a government can follow everyone, everywhere, including in every public space. It had led us early on to turn some deals down. A deal with a law enforcement agency in California that we thought was going to be used in a way that was going to discriminate against certain people. A deal with a government that we thought would be risking human rights because it was an authoritarian regime interested in deploying facial recognition across every corner of a national capital. So we did something in December that I think surprised some in the industry. We said, this needs to be regulated. It needs to be governed by law. And we outlined a proposal that we thought could move forward quickly. And I'm enthused because that was in December. We took it to some state legislatures in the United States. And just last month, the state Senate in our home state, Washington State, adopted this proposal by a vote of 46-1. And if it makes its way, as I believe it likely will, through the State House of Representatives, we may have a law that starts to reflect what needs to be done, and then people can learn from it and consider it in other capitals. The issues around AI have not only been important in facial recognition, they've been important as people think about the military and the future of AI being infused into weapons. And this has gripped a new generation of people, especially in some parts of the West Coast of the United States. It has broken into the public consciousness more broadly. If there's one thing that I've found everywhere I go, it doesn't matter who you talk to, it doesn't matter what role they play in the military or a government, no one wants to wake up in the morning and find that machines started a war while they were asleep. But we need to build on that broad consensus to create principles and policies that will protect people in a way that makes especially the democratic societies of our world feel comfortable with where technology is going. That's why we've really started increasingly to focus on the issues around autonomous weapons, and have said there needs to be broad discussion in national capitals, including with the military and defense officials, about issues like reliability and safety, about transparency, and most importantly, about accountability. How do we ensure that humans remain appropriately in the loop so that machines don't go off and make decisions that lead to people dying in ways that none of us would be comfortable seeing? If you think about these issues on AI, if you actually think about all of these issues, one of the most notable aspects is that they really require a global conversation. This is global technology. And what is so interesting is one can travel the world and go from capital to capital, and the tone of the conversation sometimes changes, but the questions that people are asking are quite consistent from place to place. And that actually makes a lot of sense, given the challenges the world is increasingly grappling with. We're going to need to reach some level of global understanding. And in some of these issues, that is far easier said than done, and for some of these issues, it may not even be possible. But when we think about issues like ethics, what we're fundamentally talking about is a set of principles that sit on an infrastructure, if you will, of philosophy, of great philosophies around the world, but different philosophies. There are days when I engage in these conversations about AI and ethics and philosophy, and I feel like I'm listening to a debate between Socrates and Confucius. But it is a debate, and it's really a conversation that the world needs to have. Because we will need ethical principles, and ultimately we will need law. Because unless you have law, only ethical people will behave ethically. If we want to live in countries and in a world that imposes some level of greater responsibility across the board when it comes to technology, there's only one way to do it, and that is through new and stronger laws. At the end of the day, we've entered this amazing period because I strongly believe that technology is going to continue to make the world a better place in some fundamentally important ways. It can enable us to solve some of the problems that concern us the most. I believe that AI will help the world find a cure for cancer much more quickly over the ensuing decade. Computers are being used to help us solve problems all around the world. But I also think that it is a moment that asks us, even requires us to step back. It was a moment even before the tragedy in Christchurch that called on us to think about where technology is going. And whenever I think about this, I often find it helpful to think about the history of technology issues. And to me, one of the most compelling, even poignant statements was uttered almost a century ago now by the person who I think many would regard as perhaps the greatest scientist of the first half of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. In 1932, the world's governments came together in Geneva for a disarmament conference. The clouds were on the horizon, especially in Europe itself. And Einstein talked about what people referred to then as the machine age, and the enormous advances of the machine age, and all of the benefits it had bestowed on society. But what he said, as you can see here, is that it could have made human life carefree and happy if only the development of the organizing power of man had been able to keep step with his technical advances. It did not. Tens of millions of people died because of that failure. That is the lesson that we have the opportunity to learn. It is what can inspire us as we go forward into the future. I believe we need to make this century better than the last, and it needs to happen at the places where the democratic countries of the world come together to make the decisions that strike the balance that needs to be struck between the power of technology and the needs of the public. Places like Canberra. Thank you very much.